There's always this critical turning point in the NDE where the individual is either shown that they must go back to fulfill commitments they've made, or in some cases they have a choice. Well, you can stay here because we know it feels so good over here, or you can go back to that really difficult place you came from. And when people make the choice to go back, it's usually for the sake of their children. That's a pattern that shows up a lot in these experiences. And it's not so much for themselves, but for the sake of their kids. And that it kind of illustrates that this side and the other side are really not that far apart. We retain our essential feelings and concerns and sense of who we are on the other side. We may experience a broader spectrum of ourselves, but we're still who we are. I mean, many afterlife investigators and mediums and so on say, we don't die. That's just a conceptual convenience at best. Our consciousness continues. The body dies, yeah, but that's not who we are. It's not who we are right now, and it's not who we are after the body passes.
Welcome to a Broaderlands podcast. The opinions expressed on Broaderlands podcast are those of the guest speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the host or Broaderlands podcast. Dan, welcome to Broaderlands podcast. What an honor to have you on.
Well, thanks so much, Boo-Boo.
I remember one day I was in Barnes Noble and I'm looking at books. I always go to my certain section and I seen your book and I started to glance at it and I was like, wow, this book's amazing.
Oh,
so I started to read it, and then I reached out to you. And thank you for coming on.
Now, this is the first time that we've really talked at length. How did you get focused in this area yourself? What turned you on to this perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. Ever since I was a kid, and I grew up in an environment where I grew up in the neighborhood and in Los Angeles, and so I really didn't talk about this stuff, but when I was a kid, I remember having some dreams and always having like some kind of glimpses of remembrance of lives. I remember seeing Indiana Jones when I was a kid, and I felt like I lived in that environment at one time, something similar. It gave me some kind of memory. Or watching those old Chinese Kung Fu movies on regular TV on the weekends, in the 80s. And I remember, I felt like I knew that environment, or watching Star Wars or Star Trek and feeling like I've been there before, so there was just like inner knowing that I couldn't explain. Like I had this intuitive feeling. So I've always been interested in this stuff, but of course I got caught up in the streets and gangs and all that stuff. But I had a spiritual awakening in 2009. And once I had that awakening, I started to come back to all of this stuff. And I think it all blends in. Science, spirituality, the paranormal, and so on. It all goes together for me.
Yeah, I think that's a really a valid perception. We use one of the things that you may recall about my book is that the longest chapter is about language. It's called "Don't Eat the Menu."
Yes,
and it's about not mistaking the word for the reality. And I think it's important when we look into the whole spectrum of metaphysical viewpoints and traditional religions and modern offshoots and New Age spirituality and certain branches of science, that we keep open minds, particularly about the language that's used. I mean, you may say the word God and mean something completely different than what I understand it to be, God or angels or whatever. And so I think part of the problem in bringing more of this perspective into our culture is the language. In our case, it's modern English, which has its own traditions and its own going way back into all the cultures that fed into what is now, the modern Western, English-dominated culture. So I think it's important for us to kind of pull back from the traditions and take our own fresh look at the landscape of the greater reality, which is my and others' general term for what we're talking about here. And the more we dig into it with fresh eyes, clearly we can see it, the better questions we can ask, the better we can communicate among ourselves about it. So, verbal discussions about it are challenging sometimes, but we do the best we can with it. And it was from that perspective that I wrote my book, A New Science of the Afterlife.
Yeah, in that chapter you just discussed, you brought up, you have a section. One of my favorite sections is where you clean up the semantic messes, and I love that because you clarify certain things, and I really appreciate that section a lot.
I enjoyed writing that. One of my favorite examples of the language issue, when we say somebody, everybody, nobody.
Yeah.
Well, we're kind of subconsciously reinforcing the idea that we're nothing but our bodies. And this is, of course, very prevalent in the culture. Everyone says somebody, nobody, everybody. We start saying someone, everyone, no one. I think it shifts our awareness a little bit from the body to the one who inhabits the body, as it were. And then that's another tricky concept. Do we really inhabit our bodies, or is that another level of illusion? I sometimes, when I give presentations, I ask, live presentations, I'll ask, could we already be dead and not realize it? And what I mean by that is our consciousness, almost by definition, our consciousness on the other side, and are we just looking through these eyes? And obviously through experiencing our bodies as ourself. But is that what's really going on? Is that a level of illusion? So these are the kind of questions I love to ask. And very often when I'm giving presentations and I ask these questions, people come up with some really interesting perspectives and report their own experiences that otherwise wouldn't have come up. I think my experience in general of asking people about, say, odd experiences they've had, whether it's with UFOs or ghosts or whatever it is that people are at first reluctant to admit what they've experienced, for fear of social ostracism, of course. But when you really get down to talk to them, some of them will deny and say, "Oh, I've never had anything like that happen to me," blah, blah, blah. And then they'll say, "Oh, wait a minute. There was this thing that happened when I was 14 years old." And then the whole thing sort of comes tumbling out. Rupert Sheldrake, well-known biologist who's kind of been a radical thorn in the side of mainstream science for a while, he talks about the things that scientists and academics talk about in the pubs after hours, that they would not talk about with their students or among themselves publicly. So I think, apart from the facts that we're beginning to discover about the nature of the greater reality, our definitions and our social norms around this are beginning to shift. Makes sense to you?
Makes a lot of sense. I think I'm starting to recognize that myself.
Well, you've been interviewing people on your podcast for how long?
Coming up, over a year now. A little over a year now.
So you must be getting a taste of this.
Oh yeah, I'm having a lot of. You talk about in your book about shared death experiences, and I had an experience with my father. And I've gotten a deeper understanding by these interviews, and sharing with people that had near-death experiences, and just a better understanding. And I'm not crazy, I'm not weird, and better terminology to use as well. I never even knew the term shared death experience. I would automatically say my consciousness tapped into my father's consciousness.
Well, sort of labeling is important.
Yeah.
It can be limiting, but it can also bring awareness into the mainstream. The things that have been going on for ages, but they haven't been labeled yet.
Mm.
So that can be very helpful. Particularly things like the shared death experience, where someone at the bedside of a person who's passing will experience sometimes going with them, accompanying them to the first stages of the afterlife, or they will witness some energy arising from the body. And what was your experience in that case?
What happened was, for me, is my father fell off a cliff,
Ooh.
and I ran all the way down to a staircase, maybe a mile and a half away. And I ran down these staircases and got down to the rocks and ran all the way back to where my father's body was, me and my uncle. And I grab him and he's dead. But during that time, I found myself looking at everything outside of my body. And I'm looking at the whole scene. I could see everything outside of me from a distance. And I seen me holding my father and my uncle right next to me. I seen the paramedics, the firemen, police, people looking at the over the cliffs at the whole scene. So that's what I experienced, and I wonder if if that was my father telling me there's no such thing as death. Because when I had my awakening, I got back into. I talked about feeling like I lived in India at one time. When I had my awakening in 2009, those teachings came to me without me looking. Kind of like that Rumi quote: "What you're seeking is seeking you." And I started to study the Bhagavad Gita, a lot of the scriptures from the Hindu scriptures, but what they talked a lot about how we don't die. Who we really are doesn't die. You can't kill the self. And it gave me confirmation. So I wonder if that was my father's way of showing me that, hey, we're so much more than this body, which you touch on very well in this book. So I appreciate you coming on.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Well, that was some experience, and particularly, the whole thing happened right in front of you. That must have been pretty traumatic in itself.
Yeah. I wish that changed my life at that time, but I still went through my stuff until I had my awakening.
Mm.
Which brings me to the questioning, how did your personal experiences or upbringing help shape you to get into this study of the afterlife?
Well, it's hard to know exactly when it first started for me, but I remember as a child, I experienced quite a number of precognitive dreams,
Mm.
and um, they were kind of fun. I enjoyed it, and I was puzzled by it, and I didn't understand it, but it was enough to show me that, as I put it, in the theater of life, stuff goes on backstage.
Mm.
That there's whole other levels of space, time, and experience that exist in real time behind our normal consciousness, behind our normal sensory inputs, and our experience of being physical. So that was an interesting start. I think probably the next thing that piqued my interest, and this was back in the late 1940s. Lived on the East Coast, grew up in the middle of New Jersey,
Mm.
and at that time, the taboo around discussing the UFO had not really fallen into place. That happened really in the 1950s. So it was a perfectly respectable topic of discussion. And there was a radio commentator, a newscaster, who did an evening program on a New York City radio station, which I listened to pretty regularly. And one night he reported a UFO sighting and landing uh,
Mm.
very close to the Fort Dix military reservation, which was not that far from where I lived. And this may sound silly, but my first reaction to that was, oh, my people are coming back.
Oh.
Where did that come from? You know, and I always I felt that human beings looked a little funny. So I, even at that point, I had some kind of, whether it's literally ET, um, kind of a perspective on my human reality, unfolded more into more investigation of the whole ET UFO question, and um, and the mysteries that legitimately surrounded it and still do to some extent. I was already kind of, had one foot out of the mainstream reality. And that was helpful when I first became interested in what we call the afterlife, which is really much later, probably into the 1990s. And then around 2000, shortly after 2000, I started doing some research. This began with my interest in some work by Mark Macy, who was an afterlife investigator. He had been using a device called the Luminator, which is without getting into a lot of details, it's a device that enables paranormal photography, almost on demand. I'm working on a little short video about that at this time. But he was also into researching instrumental transcommunication, which is communication from the other side through our modern electronics. And I was actually a bit skeptical at first, but the more I studied about it and the more people I met who were actually doing this practice, the more I was convinced that, hey, this is a really interesting window into the other side. So up with a co-producer, Tim Coleman, and he and I traveled across the United States to England, Scotland, Spain, and shot these two documentaries, which I think you've seen. One is called Calling Earth, and the other is called Skoll, the Afterlife Experiment. And I won't get too much into the details, but basically these were two contexts in which very robust afterlife communication was taking place. The Skoll experiment was the brainchild of two couples in England who worked in this very tiny village of Skoll between 1994 and 1999, doing a practice called physical mediumship, which entails connecting with beings on the other side, and in their case, working together to create experiments that demonstrated that there are interdimensional communication, interdimensional transfer of energy and matter, and this is a very robust and extremely well-controlled experiment for a period of time. I think it was 2 years, investigators from the British Society for Psychical Research attended these sessions. And these guys are Ghostbusters. They know all the tricks, but they were never able to find any kind of evidence of trickery. The results included paranormal photography, images that would appear on sealed film, brand new sealed film, recordings in electronic voices through electronic equipment from the other side, engaging in dialogue with them. At one point, there were physical materializations of people on the other side to hear. Robin Foy, one of the chief experimenters, claimed that he had several of his deceased relatives physically show up in the room. And there were all kinds of things. Each of the sessions were conducted pretty much in total darkness, except for a few that involved experiments with video cameras. And they recorded each session on audio tape, so I have a complete record of this. Robin Foy, the chief experimenter, wrote a book based on all the recordings of all these 500 sessions. It's called Witnessing the Impossible. It's available on Amazon. And if you have the time and the stamina, it's an incredible read. There's also a popular book about it and our documentary, and there was a lot of press coverage at one point. They also took, once they had established their practices, they also went on the road. They did sessions in several European countries. They came over here. They did sessions in Los Angeles of a local medium there. I went down and interviewed the participants 10 years after their experience there, and they were still jazzed by it. and gave very detailed descriptions of their experiences there. So, this is the skull experiment is among the most, so you might say, watertight demonstrations of transcommunication. Our other film, Calling Earth, is about folks who use ordinary electronics to communicate with the other side. This began actually back in the 1950s when tape recorders first became consumer items. And people started hearing on their tapes. Occasionally they would hear these strange voices that didn't belong there. And so in the beginning, and mostly in the United States, these voices were kind of dismissed as, maybe the machine's picking up a radio broadcast. But in Europe, these things were taken more seriously. There's a Swedish film producer and artist named Friedrich Jürgensen, who went out one night with his new portable tape recorder to record nocturnal bird sounds for a documentary. And when he played back the tape, between the nocturnal bird sounds, he heard faint voices discussing nocturnal bird sounds. So for his first guess was, well, maybe this was picking up a radio discussion about nocturnal bird sounds, and as unlikely as that might have been. But then shortly after that, when he heard the voice of his deceased mother calling him by his childhood nickname, he realized that something else was going on. This actually turns out to be a common experience. Very often, the first voices people will hear when they're doing this kind of work are those of deceased relatives calling them by names that no one else would know. This is also true of there's a German scientist who's in my film, and he, as a physicist, Senkowski, heard his mother calling him by his nickname, and then his deceased father calling him by his pet name. So these things are very, very hard to explain other than as genuine experiences. One woman who's in my film, Albert, lives up in Washington State. Son Braden died in 2001 and in a kayaking accident. And he first started coming to her on their answering machine. And she was in the habit of not picking up the phone. She always let any calls go through to the answering machine. So she kind of kicked herself for not picking up the phone that day. But her son, Braden, left a message on her answering machine. You can see this in my film. She had heard about a group of mothers who were doing this practice. They call themselves the Big Circle. So she contacted them, and they said, well, we've been hearing from this kid, Braden, who's over on the other side. Do you know anything about him? And Vicky said, that's my son. So Braden had actually joined that group before his mom did. And you'll hear some of these communications in my film, Calling Earth. So, one thing led to another, and I became very interested in this practice, and partly because it's objective evidence. It turns out that a lot of people have been doing this practice for some time. I know several people who've been involved in it, and it's quite repeatable. It's sometimes hit or miss. We don't understand the conditions that either enhance it or impede it. Some people say it works best during the waxing phase of the moon. I don't know, because I don't know of any experiments that have been done to demonstrate that. But I think that the scientific approach is very important in helping these things come into the mainstream. Science is basically organized curiosity. It's not to be confused with materialistic philosophy or viewpoint, which it often is. We feel that something isn't real until materialistic science has confirmed it in materialistic terms. So anyway, that's one reason why I feel that things like instrumental transcommunication, also called the electronic voice phenomenon, are very important because they produce relatively repeatable and very robust results. Anyway, that's really just one of a number of fields that are emerging now as um, within elements of the scientific community, you might say. Um, Probably one of the most important, which has been going on now since the 1970s, really, is research in near-death experiences. And these are valuable because we have the words of folks who've gone to the other side and come back. Folks who've been resuscitated after accidents, drownings, and so forth, illnesses. And there's a they're not just making this stuff up. There's a consistency about their experiences and their reports. There's an organization called IANDS, International Association for Near-Death Studies, and they have chapters all over the world. Here in the San Francisco Bay Area, I was attending for a period of years these presentations where folks would come and talk to us about their experiences. And that was really quite an experience for me. Over time, you get to see what's individual to these experiences and where the commonalities. There are kind of offshoots of NDE studies. For example, there's a considerable body of lore about people who say were in a traffic accident or got hit by a car and they're underneath the car, and all of a sudden someone shows up to help them, to console them and say, you'll be okay. They'll be coming, the EMTs will be here in 5 minutes, so on. Meanwhile, don't move, etc. And then the person disappears. It can't be tracked down. So these are, arguably examples of materialization intended to help the person who was in distress. Of course, there's a huge amount of reincarnation research. For example, it's gone on at the University of Virginia Medical School for decades, and that's in my book. There's a link to a video discussion of the 50 years of work that they've done at the University of Virginia, which has been very impressive and very courageous, considering the prejudices of the academic community. So, then there's traditional mental mediumship, which has been, which is quite often used by police departments to solve crimes, find the bodies, find the evidence, so on. And this, people don't talk about this a lot, but it's true. It's done that way, and it's very effective. It's not unrelated to the work that the Army and the CIA did at Stanford Research Institute some years ago in remote viewing, where their subjects were able to obtain actionable evidence in a military context, and that's not woo-woo, So there's no lack of evidence. There's no lack of systematic studies. What there has been a lack of up until now it's really more sociological than anything else, and psychological. Because if we're afraid to talk about stuff, we won't find out anything about it. We won't be able to compare notes. And we call these things paranormal, but how normal or abnormal are they? If we can't talk about it, how do we know? So I think one of the things that's happening now is people are relaxing more about it, and as it becomes more common subject of discussion in our culture, there are many podcasts now that I've been, since my book is out, I think this may be the 20th podcast I've been interviewed on, and that says something, that the world is ready to open its mind about this, and it'll take a while for it to become a much more. I mean, let's look at things like psychedelics. It used to be such a taboo item, and now it's mainstream, and psychedelics are being used therapeutically, openly. It's no longer controversial, but it used to be like super taboo, and super criminalized and all that. And some of it is just a matter of lack of understanding, lack of experience with these things. But it's the social groupthink factor, I think, is the main issue that we're dealing with here. So I think we're on the way to a more open understanding and a more compassionate understanding of people's unusual experiences. People, folks who have admitted to having near-death experiences very often had been, and I think some still are to some extent, socially ostracized, forced into mental institutions, so on, you know, condemned by their clergy who don't believe in such things in spite of believing in heaven.
Yeah.
And so anyway, we're on our way, I think, to a more excuse me, to a more open-minded and interesting and compassionate attitude about all this. Particularly in this country and in the Western countries, particularly. I don't know, outside of our own culture, I'm not particularly aware of how these things are accepted apart from the traditional belief systems. Sorry,
but in some sense, this must make you happy, because I'm sure when you first started doing this research and studying this stuff, it wasn't very welcomed or open. The shift in interest in the collective has changed dramatically. So that must kind of bring a smile to your face when you kind of could look back and see the difference from when you first started to the present. Am I correct?
You're absolutely correct. It's a different time now, and we're still not there as in the culture as a whole. But I think it's inevitable that this opening up of understanding and willingness to discuss these things, I think we're on our way.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question on near-death experiencers?
Sure.
Why is it that their belief systems help shape their reality when they're on the other side?
Probably for the same reason that it does on this side. We assume that everyone sees things as we do. I think, if all you have to do is look in the political sphere to see that that's not true. But in the political sphere, you find collective beliefs that each contending group swears as absolute truth. But in terms of the individual personal experience, you and I can be sitting at a table, and we can both agree that there's a table there. But I have no idea how you experience that table. Even on a level of raw sensory input and interpretation, there's no way I can get into your head, and I could theoretically get into your head and get information, but I can't get your experience, either of just even how you perceive that table, whether you perceive up as down relative to what I perceive, and also whatever conscious and subconscious associations you might have with that table. It may be of a certain color that sets off a train of association subconsciously in your mind. And on some level, you are back at the age of 3, reliving some either delightful or uncomfortable experience. So, we are to some extent at the mercy of our senses. People ask me, well, we use the phrase the veil, this what's beyond the veil and so forth. And so what's the veil? To me, the veil is our senses, which can only perceive a very narrow band of even a physical reality. We can't see in the dark like cats. We can't perceive ultraviolet the way some birds do. We can't hear as well as dogs can in a number of respects. So these other members of our earthly menagerie live in a different world than we do. It smells different. It looks different. Or different things will attract their attention depending on who they are. Just watch cats, dogs, birds. They're not in our world in the sense that we may believe. So our own senses, if we're going to explore beyond the veil, i.e. beyond our senses, then by definition we have to shift the focus of our consciousness, and that can happen through meditation, where we're excuse me, detaching from our physical senses to some extent, through the use of psychedelics, through the use of hypnosis and so on. It's just to get our inner attention off of the limited matrix or framework that our senses and our bodies limit us to. So, and anyone's free to do that if they feel they can handle it. It's when you've been in a box for decades and you're let out, it can be a bit overwhelming. But most people who, for example, in their near-death experiences, who are not seeing things with their senses because their senses are shut down, their bodies are shut down, so they're perceiving with their consciousness directly, and tend to be aware of how their consciousness creates the reality they perceive. We can do this with, for example, lucid dreaming. Now we know that when we're in the middle of a dream, that's reality to us. That's perfectly 100% real. So again, subjectively, we also know that our subconscious experiences, memories, and so on can trigger certain kinds of dreams. So we know that on the one hand, it seems 100% real to us. On the other hand, we realize that it's a construct. It's a creation. It's a work of art, you might say. And so in between our normally unconscious practice of dreaming and full-blown mediumship or experience of the other side is what's called lucid dreaming. And that is an approach where you consciously develop the ability to to create your dreams, to work your dreams as if they were an artist's palette. And I call lucid dreaming the kindergarten of the afterlife, because that's where you learn how the mind relates to what you take to be reality. So I hope that answers your question, that the nature of the afterlife is infinite. It's infinitely malleable and shapeable by our minds, our intentions, conscious and otherwise. So it's the basic difference between the physical world and the world of consciousness, is that in the world of consciousness, we are responsible in some sense for our own experience. Now, even in our bodies, we're still responsible for our own experience, but it's our awareness of that is overridden by the intensity of of our physical experiences, just being in the body. Our body is solid, or we know it's mostly liquid, but and that's another interesting point that sometimes missed. That skeptics, particularly, they'll pound on the table and say this is reality, as if the physical world were made up only of solid matter. And about liquids, gases, um, and uh, what am I thinking of? Plasmas. I'm sorry. So psychologically, our materialistic bias, cultural bias, um, kind of impels us to view our physical reality as primarily solid. That's only part of it. How would you like to, go into Starbucks and order a coffee and have it be solid in the cup, or take a shower, and this water is solid. So again, a lot of this is like psychological and social. And the truth is very often a lot simpler than that, and more easily accessed than we might think. So, go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
What's interesting, and probably one of the most common questions you get, is what happens to us when we leave this body? What happens to us when we die?
What do you think happens to us when we die?
You know what? That's a good question. To be honest, I do not know. I know I believe we go into a different reality. I don't believe we die. Who our true essence is cannot die. I don't think it dies. One of the topics I love in your book is you talk about life between lives. I would love for you to touch on that, because what does happen to us? I do believe that we're no longer attached to this body, and we move on. But that's as far as I can even explain.
I don't know. I think that the most general answer I could give to that is, again, that our experience on the other side is as varied as it is here.
Mm.
That we're on a certain track in our experience, in our being, in our soul development, however you might want to call that, and that what we experience is considered to be appropriate to the track on which we're growing as souls. Some of us, are here to explore physicality. Sports folks who end up as career sports people, for example. That's one path of experience and learning in your relationship with the body, and that can include everything from football players to dancers. Working with the body as an art, almost. I don't know if you call football an art, but I think in some ways,
In some ways it is.
Sports qualify. So there are many different tracks of experience we can be on, and in our between lives experience, apparently from everything we've learned so far, we get to look back on our recent life, to evaluate it, to say, how did I do in my development along this or that line? Is there anything that I could do better if I choose to go back at some point, either in a near-death experience? Of course, this comes up. There's always this critical turning point in the NDE where the individual is either shown that they must go back to fulfill commitments they've made, or in some cases they have a choice. Well, you can stay here because we know it feels so good over here, or you can go back to that really difficult place you came from. And when people make the choice to go back, it's usually for the sake of their children. That's a pattern that shows up a lot in these experiences. And it's not so much for themselves, but for the sake of their kids. And that it kind of illustrates that this side and the other side are really not that far apart. In our essential feelings and concerns and sense of who we are on the other side, we may experience a broader spectrum of ourselves, but we're still who we are. I mean, many afterlife investigators and mediums and so on say we don't die. That's just a conceptual convenience at best. Our consciousness continues. The body dies, yeah, but that's not who we are. It's not who we are right now, and it's not who we are after the body passes. So I'm sorry if I've gone a little off the track here, but
Oh no.
maybe you want to repeat the question.
Oh no, I thought it was perfect. You brought up the life review in a way,
Oh yeah.
and I love the life review because when I hear someone sharing about their life review that come back that had that near death experience, they come back with a lot more compassion, a lot more mindfulness, a lot more of awareness. It feels like they're more heart centered. And I can relate to that so much through my own spiritual awakening. That's one of the most beautiful things I love to hear when someone has an NDE that experienced the life review, because I can relate to what they went through, the shift in consciousness on that end.
And as you know, the main shift in consciousness there is having yourself put in the other person's place,
Mm,
of
yes.
experiencing how you've influenced others by experiencing what they experienced. And that can be positive or negative. And by all accounts, when we experience these very difficult um, feelings that someone else felt as a result of something we did, um, we are, as they say, held in love, and we're supported in that. And there's no condemnation. It's not a process of judgment. This is a process of our experiencing our own creation. And sure, more point here, and that is that we may do something in relation to someone else. One person would take our words as an insult. Another might take the same words as a compliment. So, we're not responsible for their being the way they are, but we are responsible to ourselves to learn the results of our actions and words can be. Anyway, but
What's interesting is I got sober in 2009 during my awakening, right? So I
hmm,
went to the 12 step community. I did these 12 steps. Well, the interesting part about the 12 steps is the fourth step, where you take a fearless and moral inventory of yourself. Well, I started to write down this list of resentments I had towards people, right? And I started to see the harms I did to others. And I got to see where was I hurt or threatened. So what I did was I put this each person I resented on stage, right? And then I wrote about it. And I replayed the whole thing on stage with them, and I sat in the audience, and I got to see where I was hurt or threatened by this experience, or how I harmed them. And I started to look at it from an entirely different angle. Like Wayne Dyer says, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. So I sat in the crowd and I started to question everything through that experience. Well, that's how I experienced that. Like that's where I relate to the near death experience, because I got to see how I affected myself and others through these experiences. And so I kind of put myself in their shoes and in my shoes, and switching over back and forth and seeing how it was harmful to myself or the other person. And that brought up a deeper sense of understanding, awareness, and which turned into a compassion for me, for myself and others. Yeah. So I just thought I'd share that because I definitely relate in many ways with that life review.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's one aspect of the life review. Um,
Yeah.
the Some people can report these experiences under hypnosis, um, awareness of what their lives are like. I mean, even those who have had, who have passed and come back and don't have memories of a life review or a near death experience, sometimes this can be brought out in hypnosis.
Mhm.
Michael, you probably know about Michael Newton's work. He was
Yeah.
a clinical hypnotherapist who started his practice back in the 1970s, and he was a very, very straight kind of guy. He started noticing that in deep hypnosis sessions, some of his clients would report what they claimed were experiences between lifetimes. And at first, he dismissed this as imagination. Started noticing consistencies among his clients in their reports. And so he sort of threw up his hands and said, well, I got to study this scientifically. Why are these different people having these similar patterns of experience? And so he started recording the sessions, analyzing them, and realizing that these people were reporting experiences from between lifetimes. And his first book, Journey of Souls, highly recommended. He describes the procedures and how he made his discovery, and then how he evolved this particular hypnotic procedure to allow people to experience life between lives, and or at least get a taste of it, certain aspects of it. And I think it's beneficial. It would be beneficial to everyone, I think, to have that experience, so we'd be less afraid of death. And anyway, his book, Journey of Souls, his first book, Journey of Souls, highly recommended. Second book is called Destiny of Souls, also highly recommended. I was privileged to have one of these hypnosis sessions with one of his trainees, and it was quite a profound experience for me. Without going into a lot of detail, it gave me a sense of why I came in here in the first place, and a sense of my purpose here. And that was very valuable in terms of personal guidance. So, that's one of many sort of breakthroughs that have been made in recent decades towards kind of normalizing the notion of an afterlife or life between lives. I don't like the term afterlife particularly, because I think it's too limiting. As I say in my book, it's like, I remember the kids' game Pin the Tail on the Donkey, and the afterlife is like this little trivial appendage that's attached to the real life here. But I think there are good arguments for thinking that it's the other way around, that our larger life is, in terms of what we think of as time, is infinite. These are just particular experiences that we have elected to participate in on this planet for the sake of our own growth, sake of our own experience, sake of our own development, our own character. And I think it's a very healthy attitude as well. This gives us perspective on our lives. As far as the greater reality is concerned, again, each individual will have their own picture of it, their own sense of it. I think what's most helpful is for us to begin to get a sense of eternity and infinity. We tend to think of reality as defined by things, spaces, limitations, dimensions. And that includes slicing and dicing time into years, lifetimes, however we want to picture it. And but suppose time never began and will never end. We think of the universe as having started with a big bang. Well, maybe this particular universe at one point did start in that way. Let's assume that for the moment. There must have been something that preceded that, for there had to have been the energy that manifested in the Big Bang. So what was that energy? And, some people call it God, some people call it this, that, the other thing. Doesn't matter how we label it. The important thing is that we begin to get friendly with the notion that time doesn't have the limits that we psychologically impose on it. And when you think in terms of eternity, a lot of things kind of fall into place. When we think of lifetime after lifetime, well, that doesn't require a big bang or a heat death of the universe, or whatever is the current scientific lore about that. When we think of consciousness as infinite, I think we can relax about many things, not holding on to any one uh, external thing, even our bodies, which from the point of view of consciousness, our bodies are external. Um, you know, appreciating them for what they are, for what they can give us. But, when it's over, it's over. And then there's the next, and then there's the next, and then there's the next, the next. It'd be a sequence of development over time, over lifetimes. But we're also told that we can skip around in time. We can die in the 21st century and choose to be reincarnated in the 16th. From the point of view of the afterlife, where there are no fixed parameters, why not? No. So it's that sort of thing is confusing from our current perspective. How could this possibly happen? There's the grandfather paradox, where if we go back in time and we kill our grandfathers, would we then not exist? And these are fun philosophical questions to ask. I don't think it works quite that way. Because when you have infinity and eternity, you also have infinite possibility. And excuse me, within infinite possibility, we can be whoever and whatever we want to be. We can move through our evolvement at any pace we want. And when we pass into the afterlife after any particular physical life, we simply get feedback. How do we do in the finite world? Because only the finite world allows development of certain qualities. When there's no resistance and no particular structure, and we can create anything we want, singly or as a group, as a collective creation. There are the environments on the other side that look and feel like cities and towns and various Earth-like environments that are basically mental creations, but they're co-creations. And to the inhabitants of the other side, it's perfectly real. Rules may be a little bit different. May not need to eat, for example, but by all accounts, if that's what we like to do, we can do it. It's just not essential to our being. So we can mock up or mimic Earth-like experiences. Eating, sleeping, sex, the whole 9 yards, but it's held in a very different way. And it's not necessarily taken to be the whole of reality. And as even, again, we're told even on the other side that there may be various levels of awareness, and that there's a progression over time, inner time, towards a higher level of vibration, higher level of being. It's fairly consistent across the near-death experiences, metaphysical literature, certain spiritual traditions, and so on. None of it is definitive or carved in stone. And I think that's one of the most important messages about it, that it's our experience in motion, in action, not so much a set of givens. Does that make sense to you?
Makes a lot of sense. When the theologian Paul Tillich says God is the ground of being, or Amit Goswami, the quantum physicist, will say consciousness is the ground of being. Is that potato?
Yeah, it's just semantics. I think a lot of philosophical arguments would be unnecessary if people just defined their terms before they started arguing.
You're right.
As you've just done. Philosopher A calls it God, philosopher B calls it, Goswami calls it something else, and I might call it something else, you might call it something else. The word is not important. The description is more important, and the our accounts of our genuine accounts of our experience are more important. So I mean, people have fought over words for years, and it's tragic, and I think also humorous when you look at it. Um, so yeah, the semantics again, and they're just labels.
It's kind of like in Spanish, agua, or in English, it's water. No, it's agua. No, it's water. I'm going to kill you. It's water.
Right.
I would just drink it.
Exactly, exactly. And you are sufficiently bilingual that you understand how relative language is. I think everyone should speak at least two languages to get that message. And not only water versus agua, but there are whole expressions in different languages that nail certain experiences and realities that you won't have in another language. I mean, if you sit in a cafe and listen to some people who are bilingual talk, they will shift from one language to the other when the other
Yeah.
language better expresses what they're trying to say. This, the expression just really nails it in Spanish, and in English we don't. It just doesn't quite work. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, language is secondary. It's secondary to experience. Language is a convenience, and it's pretty effective in terms of mundane matters. So in our current state, we can't really do without it. But it is a problem. When two cultures are so different that their languages represent very, very different sets of experiences. I'm sure that wars have been fought over the meaning of this or that word for God,
Misunderstanding.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's why I like what Meiser Eckhart said. The mystics will understand, theologians will argue.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, the
Which
theologians
you define mysticism in your book.
um, in 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 popular American English usage, it's confused with mystification or BS, and just a little linguistic research shows that it's not that at all, and I think it's unfortunate. I don't use the word mysticism myself for that reason, and I mean for some people their only reference to anything beyond the physical has to do with their religious training and their religious lexicon. And in those contexts, you might have to use whatever language is available. People who have highly religious people who've reported near-death experiences have to deal with, they will very often see a presence who represents one of their religious icons. A lot of people see Jesus and Mary, for example. I know one NDEer who swears that it was Jesus and Mary. Other NDEers swear that they know that it was a presence that was sort of benevolently masquerading in order to make them feel at ease and to give them confidence. And outside of the physical, you can take on whatever visible form you want. Even in all of us, apparently, when we go to the other side, we can present ourselves to others most frequently in the prime of life. That's the report. Over and over and over again, we get this. That I saw when I was on the other side, I saw my grandma, and she was at the age she was when I would recognize her. I saw this friend of mine, and he was 28 years old, even though he died at 90. So I think we have the choice of how we present ourselves to another in order to facilitate recognition and communication. And I don't, I think as I suggest in my book, that the other side is more like I use the phrase holographic matrix. Now, in ordinary holography, as we practice it, physical holography, you have a photographic plate, which is bathed in laser light in a certain way, so that a nearby object will be depicted on that photographic plate. But you can't see it until you shine laser light on it from the same angle that it was originally applied. And then we see the object. And if we move our point of view, we can actually see around the object, as long as we're within the dimensions of that plate. So the thing about holography is that every part of the image is present in the entire photographic plate. So imagine a realm in which, or imagine a holographic realm where we as individuals are present in some sense everywhere, and that we localize or individualize ourselves. That's how we conceive of ourselves, as a distinct entity, not separate from the whole system, but distinct. With distinct boundaries and distinct form. And we've just come into the afterlife, and our grandmother meets us there, right? What I think is going on there is that this sort of unified sphere of consciousness is localizing each of us sufficiently that we feel that we're still an individual communicating with another individual. And when I project myself to the other person as being in a particular age, it's not like I'm putting on a costume that looks like 30. That image comes to life in their consciousness. If my grandma is here and my old high school buddy who died at 18 is here, I might project a different image to the high school buddy at the same time. Got nothing to do with actual appearances or physical appearances. It's a projected image. So we apparently have that faculty of projecting an identity that is to them visually perceivable as the personality they related to as me. It facilitates communication, essentially. So in this picture that I've just drawn, we are both individual, I would say quasi-individual, and part of the whole. And depending on our level of development, whatever you want to call it, we're capable of experiencing everything from the insular individual to the whole itself, and everything in between. For example, many folks report who have come back from death with an NDE report that they were taken on a tour of the cosmos, what we call the physical cosmos. And one woman who claimed that she never had a mathematical bone in her body comes back from an NDE where she's been taken on a tour of the universe, and she understood the mathematics of creation. Well, so and there's in the NDE literature, there's so much of this sort of thing that it's almost common knowledge among those who've really studied this. So does that make sense to you?
It makes a lot of sense and a lot of food for thought. I can't wait to rewatch this. So knowing all this, what would you say is the purpose of life?
Oh. What would you say is the purpose of life?
To experience, to expand, to realize.
Yeah. Blessings. Yeah, I would agree. To some, it's to make money.
Mm.
To some, it's to experience love or to give love. Some, it's to relate to others as oneself. Yeah, our purpose of life, I think, is both universal and also self-determined. And I think part of growing up in this world is the challenge of discovering what we came here to do, because there's so much distraction and turmoil and all the rest of it. I'm reminded of a woman who claimed to be in touch with ETs from Arcturus, the Arcturians, and they were describing to her how they travel around the universe, and they are service oriented, and they learn from all these different cultures, and what they learn can be helpful to them in helping other cultures to evolve. And what she was told is that from their experience here on Earth, experience they're getting here will be useful to them anywhere in the universe, because it doesn't get much stranger and more challenging than it does in our Earth. Everything else is a pushover. So I think we need to give ourselves some credit for surviving and flourishing in the middle of this crazy world, and especially folks like yourself who have evolved in some very important ways within this lifetime. You'll when you're on the other side, they're going to pin these badges on you.
You brought up ETs, and many people still are skeptics, which is fine. They may be asking, well, where are they at?
Or they claim to be skeptics.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Or they may be asking, where are these ETs? When are we going to have this, this presence with these ETs? Recently I live in Arizona, and I live in a mountain, and I see a lot of different stuff. One time I shared and I posted it on my YouTube channel, a picture that I took, and there was a craft. I seen a craft, and what really surprised me the most is that no one else stopped to take a picture or an image of this craft, and it was pretty huge. It was like a football field or so long, wide, and it was a disc, but it was shaped as a cloud. It was decorated as a cloud, um, and the most shocking thing was not seeing it itself, but why no one else stopped. I still don't have an answer to that. Is it because of I believe in them, or or the disbelief blocks that? I don't know. It was just really interesting.
That's a good question, and I think an important one. From the research that I've done and the experiences I've had, I think it's fairly obvious that those folks who have a greater understanding of physical reality can make themselves visible to some people and not to others. And it may be by creating some sort of an energy tunnel where only someone at the end of that tunnel can see the craft or whatever it is. It may be by subtly discouraging the other drivers from looking in that direction, but not discouraging you. Anyway, the mechanism of action, we may or may not understand it, but the point is that many people have had this sort of experience where they or the people they were with were the only people who could see whatever it was. And in some cases, there's a group of people, and only some people in that group were having the experience. So the fact that they can come and go at will suggests that they're operating more in that holographic matrix, and that by slowing down their energy or however it's done, they can manifest or appear in our frequency band, if you want to call it that. So it's we've heard this sort of thing so many times over the years that we don't have the sophisticated enough model for these things to put them into our normal practical terms. But all this is by way of saying I believe you, and and that yeah, you did have that experience. I had an experience once where I was with a friend in a remote area, and I was put to sleep for a period of some minutes, and my friend was put to sleep as well. I have no memory of what happened during that time. She had a memory of a UFO coming down, landing. Whether it was physical or not, I can't tell you. She couldn't tell me. But she said it came down in this field where we were, and these little guys got out, and they invited her to approach them. And she said, as she did, she began to enter into their consciousness, and said it was so unlike ours, so strange, that it really caused her a great deal of distress. And it was not that they were hostile. It's just that their consciousness was so different from ours that she couldn't digest it. She couldn't receive it. And so she had to back off from them. And that was what she reported to me from her experience. And it was reported in great detail. This was not some hallucination or dream. Whether this UFO was physical or whether it landed on another plane that she was at in her dream, I can't tell you. But I was fascinated by this account of her being invited by them and not being able to approach them because she was feeling more and more and more of how they perceived reality, and it was just too much for her. And I have to tell you that I say we were both put to sleep. I awoke before she did, and I didn't want to wake her, but I saw that her body was moving in a way that was like she was having a nightmare or something like that. But that wasn't it. That was her experience of this being challenged by being in proximity to a consciousness that was so different from ours. Like, jamming 100 pounds of reality into a 5-pound bag. It doesn't work that way. And later on, a psychic source that I'd asked about this said that this was as tentative an experiment on their part as it was on hers, and that we could go back there and try again sometime if we wanted to. We decided not to, but it was an educational experience, you might say, and it suggested that our way of perceiving things is only one way. Not that any two of us have identical perceptions, but generally speaking, the way we are constructed as humans, we have a certain range of perception. Others who may have different physiological, different cerebral designs, you might say, maybe designed to perceive other spectrums of reality, which may include ours, but may go beyond that. And as a result of that wider perception, their sciences presumably can produce technology like what we see in the UFOs that are just not obvious on our level. And their technology, again, if you want to call it that, can tune in and out of our reality. We know that so many witnesses have described, the thing appeared and then it disappeared. And it didn't physically move off; it just blinked out. So, we're really just in our infancy in terms of understanding who and what we're dealing with, and which looks more and more as if the whole ET menagerie has been here for a long time, maybe a lot longer than we have, and we're just waking up to it. And I've I sort of have a perverse sympathy for those who have been keeping the lid on the UFO issue because it's so huge. How do we, apart from the special interests and the reverse engineering and the military stuff, set that stuff aside for a moment. Just on the level of people getting their minds blown, of religions crumbling, or believing they need to go to war against these devils. Since we've been cut off from this particular aspect of the greater reality for so long, it's a stretch for us to suddenly be thrown into the deep end of the pool. So my guess is that when the time is right, that we will be initiated slowly into so some people call the greater community, and that it's only been 60, 70 years since the flying saucer was acknowledged, and that's not a whole lot of time, historically speaking. But again, our world is a really tough nut. There are challenges here that you probably won't find in more evolved societies, and so it's a kind of it's a dicey game, opening up a civilization to something that's vaster than they can imagine or have only imagined in science fiction. Anyway, that's my point of view on it. I could be wrong about all of it.
I appreciate it. What's interesting is a lot of these encounters now with ETs or abductions, some people don't like that word. A lot of these are not physical encounters or abductions. They're actually outer body now, which is, I find interesting
I think to
learn about.
There may be both, and there may be sort of an in-between state where the abductee is physically taken out through the wall of their house, in a way where the atomic structure of the body and the atomic structure of the wall don't interfere. And then there are abductions which are purely out of body. So, and we don't know for sure yet, but my guess, just from all the information that I've gathered, is that there's more than one way of doing it. I don't know if you've seen you've heard about cattle abductions, I'm sure.
Yes.
You've seen that there's a clip on YouTube that shows a cow that's been abducted, that's been dropped, and it drops through the metal roof of the barn, busts the roof and the framework, and this cow, just poor animal, is just set down in the middle of this barn. And the story, as I understand it, was that the farmer heard some noise outside, went out with a flashlight, and he shined it, and there was this cow being levitated into this UFO. And when the farmer shined his light on it, the cow was dropped. And the video, and you can sort of Google it up and say, video of cow dropped into barn, and it'll come up. And it's shot off a surveillance video monitor. And there's been a lot of debate about it. I can't find any problem with it. And I've done a lot of I've been a filmmaker all my life, and I've done a lot of photo analysis for people like Whitley Strieber and Linda Moulton Howe. I've seen it all. And I would say that this video is, I can't find any flaws in it. Let's put it that way. So, this is just one little piece of evidence that we have. I think if you put it all together in one place, it would be pretty mind-blowing.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your time. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you. And I appreciate your contributing your own stories and your own experience. That's really important. And
thank you.
Maybe we can do some of this again sometime.
I would love to, because I have 1,000 more questions to ask you.
Oh, sure.
I'm gonna end it with.
Yeah.
I'm gonna end it with a quote from your book that you put from Ram Dass, who I really love, and he said, "When you die, you take everything with you but the body." Thank you for sharing and expanding on that with us tonight.
Thank you, Boo Boo. It's been a pleasure. See you
Thank
again
you.
soon, I hope.
Sounds good. Take care.
You too.
Just know we out here. Know we out here working in a major way. Had to speak on it just to make a play. Any given subject, know we make a way. Time to level up on a day-to-day. Know we out here working for the greater good. Expand your mind, broaden your lens the way you should. From the stars to the galaxy to speak on spirituality. Higher understanding for the neighborhood.